you. Yeah, as he said, we're working out of the Dr. Dan Potter lab, and our focus has turned a lot from turf to the urban landscape, specifically looking at pollinator conservation. I'm here to speak a little bit about bee conservation in the urban landscape, and we have two other members of our lab, Adam Baker, who's a new master's student, who's going to be speaking after me on monarch conservation, and then we decided, since it's kind of a hot topic issue right now, that we'd bring along our local mosquito expert to give a brief introduction about Zika and mosquitoes and what are our risks for Zika in Kentucky. So I'll begin with, there we go. All right. So bees have been making the news a lot recently, unfortunately more often for bad news rather than good news. Just a couple days ago, you may have heard about the big bee kill in South Carolina that happened as a result of a NALED application in order to control for Zika mosquitoes. And the one that I usually use, which is the Oregon bee kill, happened just a couple years ago, and that was when a couple of pesticide applicators made a misapplication to linden trees in bloom and ended up killing off several thousand bees in a Target parking lot, which was also extremely visible and very upsetting. In addition, I'm sure we've all heard about things like colony collapse disorder and, again, the general decline of bees in North America. But a big question is, why is all this attention on bees in the first place? Why do we really care about bees? And I mean, you guys are growers. You know at least a little bit of why we care about bees and why there's so much public attention on these guys. First of all, they are a major source of our food, and they're very important to U.S. agriculture. The statistic goes every third bite of food we enjoy comes to our table as a result of pollination services provided by bees. Things like a lot of our fruits, a lot of our vegetables, nuts, all of these are thanks to pollination services by bees. And these pollination services just to U.S. agriculture are valued at around $20 billion a year, which is an incredible amount that we gain from pollination services. So it is very important to make sure that our bee populations are still there and still able to provide these really valuable resources that we can't get from other insects. The California almond industry alone requires the use of 1.4 million honeybee colonies, which is an extremely large portion of commercial honeybee colonies in the U.S. And note, it's 1.4 million honeybee colonies, not 1.4 million honeybees. Each of those colonies is composed of hundreds and hundreds of workers in addition. But outside from the agricultural setting, in the urban landscape, pollination services provided by bees can be very valuable to us, not only in pollinating our backyard gardens, but also providing food for urban wildlife and making sure some of our showier ornamentals, especially ones that form berries and fruit, are able to actually produce those berries, produce those fruit. Now, when we're talking about bees, most people think of European honeybees, which, as the name implies, are not native to the U.S. These are our crop animal. These are our livestock bee that are raised mainly for the use of honey and then for carting off to various agricultural settings in order to provide pollination services. And they were brought around in the early 1600s to North America specifically. But besides our European honeybee, we also have around 4,000 species of native bees, which includes things like bumblebees, like carpenter bees, sweat bees, leaf-cutting bees, digger bees. We have a really astounding variety of native bees. If you want to see more, I mean, this poster just has a couple of species on there, but I mean, Google image search our native bees, and it is fascinating to see the variety of sizes and colors, and just looking into their life histories, the variety of different ways that they live and survive is just really fascinating. So we care about these guys too, because they often provide unique pollination services. You may be familiar with blueberry cultivation. They usually require some of our native bees to pollinate. A lot of our fruit trees are really heavily reliant on some of our megachilid leafcutter bee specialists. And to make things a little bit clear also, we are, when we're talking about bees, we're talking about not just honeybees and our native bees, but we are definitely not talking about wasps or hornets or any of those other more aggressive predators. Wasps and bees are very different, and you can tell in a couple of different ways. Mostly wasps are bald. They have a pretty striking coloration, and they don't have hairs that are suitable for carrying pollen. So you usually won't see them covered in pollen right next to a plant. They really don't provide many pollination services to plants. In addition, they feed their young on meat. They are predatory. Usually the meat is in form of pieces of caterpillar. So this makes them generally a little bit more aggressive than bees. Bees, on the other hand, tend to feed their young on pollen and nectar. They're the nice little cows of the insect world. They're herbivores largely. And they have branched hairs that are very well suited for carrying pollen. If the laser works on this, which I don't think it does. They are very well suited for carrying pollen, and so are able to provide those pollination services to plants. And so they're the good guys. Additionally, they're really not that aggressive. They're pretty darn docile, unless you're right next to a hive and bothering a hive. And the native bees, since a lot of them are solitary, they don't form large colonies, are pretty docile as well, unless you're actively or accidentally trying to squish them. And from personal experience, most of the bee stings that happen in urban settings are generally a result of things like yellow jacket nests, people stepping on those and not realizing. So the big question is, so we know honeybee and native bee populations are declining across the US, but why is this happening? People are very quick to point fingers at a lot of different things. Pesticides get a big finger pointed at them. Habitat loss gets pointed a big finger at it. But really, it's kind of a perfect storm of factors that are contributing to the decline of bees in North America. So you've got things like parasitic mites, exotic diseases coming to prominence. You've got stressful management practices with regards to European honeybees. You've got habitat loss, and you've got acute and chronic pesticide exposure, all of which are sort of taking hits at bee health and really, really causing a decline in populations. So colony collapse disorder specifically was first reported in 2006, and this is a very specific syndrome. Just because a beekeeper loses a honeybee colony doesn't mean that it's colony collapse disorder. Colony collapse disorder specifically refers to when the workers abandon a hive for no apparent reason. We have some ideas for why this might happen, but it is largely unexplained why they just up and go. And this leaves the queen and the immature bees without anybody to care for them or provide them for food, and usually this results in the death of the colony. Additionally, we think that things like Varroa mites and diseases and fungi might play a role contributing to colony collapse disorder. Varroa mites are particularly nasty. I don't know how many of you might keep bees and have encountered these guys, but they're really, really nasty. You can see them, we have an immature bee right here, and then we have them on the adult. And you can see these are quite large compared to the size of the adult bee body. And there are several on a single bee. And these sit on the bee and they suck out blood, and they can sometimes transmit diseases. So it's a 1-2 punch of nasty things for them. And if we put these into a human scale, they'd be about the size of a large dinner plate on you. So imagine about 4 or 5 of those on your body sucking your blood and giving you diseases, and you can understand why this is such a big threat specifically to European honeybees. In addition, we see a trend in higher pathogen loads in colonies that experience colony collapse disorder, things such as exotic bee viruses like this deformed wing virus, and things like nosema, which is a fungus that essentially causes bee dysentery. Another factor we think may be contributing to colony collapse disorder is poor nutrition. A couple of studies have shown that feeding bees, replacing bee feed from the mix of nectar and pollen that they get, that honey that they get, replacing that with things like mixes of high fructose corn syrup or other simple sugars really doesn't replace all of the micronutrients that they're getting from the honey and from the variety of flowers that they get nectar from. And this affects bees throughout their life, but especially as an adult, it can really compromise their immune system, making them more susceptible to those exotic bee viruses, to Nosema fungus, and to getting pathogens. Just like you and me, bees can be stressed out by a lot of travel. Here we see a map of general rotations of bee colonies to hit certain crops. Starting over here, like you see, in going to California to get sunflowers, apples, cherries, almonds, et cetera, going all the way around the country. Some of these bee colonies are traveling through significant parts of the year in conditions which really promote the transmission of diseases. So not only do you have a stress colony because it's being carted around and it's getting heated up and it's jostled around, but you also have a lot of colonies in very close contact with each other. So if one colony on that truck has Varroa mites or other diseases or fungi, you're risking that entire truckload's worth of colonies getting that disease as well, which is really only encouraging the spread of some of these diseases. Now, factors that are affecting all bees declining in North America. Environmental stressors. This is really huge. Having less varied and less nutritious pollen and nectar available, especially as a result of large swaths of monoculture, whether it's an absence because we have large swaths of only grass that doesn't flower, or large swaths of agricultural land that's devoted to a single crop. This is bad for bees, not only because it eliminates natural habitat that usually has a wide variety of flowers opening at a wide variety of times throughout the entire growing season, but because it really, the disturbance regime can also take away a lot of their natural habitat that they would use to nest and to forage in. Additionally, accidental or chronic exposure to pesticides. Huge factor. They're definitely a contributor to the decline of bees. Now, the part that I specifically wanted to address with my project, with my research project, was habitat loss. Because when you take large natural areas and you bulldoze them and you replace them with suburbs with their nice white picket fences and monoculture lawns and maybe a couple of species of flowering plants, you really, again, you limit the nesting sites available for our native bees, you limit the food resources available for bees. And fortunately, the public is becoming increasingly aware, and I'm sure by now you've had plenty of questions or plenty of sites that are recommending bee-friendly plants, and this is great to see a lot of public interest in. However, a lot of these lists aren't necessarily backed up by hard data. A lot of them rely on anecdotal evidence. In addition, they can be very vague. With over 4,000 species of native bees, just saying, oh, the visitation by pollinators, bees visited. It's like, yes, but what kind of bee? We have over 4,000 bees. That really doesn't describe whether it's a good tree, whether it's a good flower for bumblebees, whether it's good for carpenter bees, whether it attracts a diverse variety of bees, or whether it's only attracting one species. These are very important things to know. So the objectives for my project, for part of my research project, were threefold. Firstly, I wanted to survey the pollinator assemblages on over 55 species, and right now we're just shy of 75 species. I originally started out at over 35 species. I was like, yeah, over 35, that sounds great. And then it ballooned into 55, and then I had another season and we kept on adding plants because we kept on seeing good ones. And so now we're pushing 70. I think we're right at like 71, 72 species that we have surveyed. And we're looking at specifically flowering woody ornamentals, so shrubs and trees that are suitable for urban landscape use. And why I really wanted to focus on woody shrubs and ornamentals was because of their long-term value to bees. I really wanted something that a homeowner could plant, really invest in, and not have to constantly be replanting year after year after year. Additionally, trees and shrubs can provide sometimes larger swaths of resources, especially when you're looking at things like a mature linden tree, the valuable resources that it provides to bees when it's at its full growth. It's just huge. We also wanted to identify where bees may be at risk from insecticide exposures. So not only looking for bee attractive plants, but really trying to identify those bee attractive plants that are also highly pest prone, because we're also interested in reducing the risk of bees to exposure to pesticide. So where we can sort of point out to homeowners, yes, this is a very bee attractive plant, but it's also going to get hit really hard with Japanese beetles. So either don't plant it if you think you want to keep it completely unscathed, or be careful when you're treating, and be mindful of what you're treating it with in order to reduce the hazard to bees. And lastly, we really wanted to try to spur demand for these horticulturally desirable woody plants that are ideally both pest-free and bee attractive. To us, it's easiest to reduce the risk of pesticide exposure to bees by simply recommending plants that don't really have many recorded pests, if any at all. And so here are just a selection of the plant species that we sampled. And we chose plants based on our own observations, based on talking with horticulturalists and landscape managers. We looked at their suitability for planting within Kentucky. Some of them, you know, where we're just on the edge of the ranges, we decided not to include because they really weren't useful for us Kentucky growers. In addition, we wanted to look at their disease history, whether these are plants that are getting hit hard with diseases and pests constantly, or whether they were relatively disease-free. And all of our sample sites were located within the urban landscape. So particularly, the majority of our sites were located within Lexington, Kentucky, and Cincinnati, Ohio. And within those, we had a lot of sites located within urban arboreta and cemeteries and schools and street side plantings. Particularly, shout out to the University of Kentucky Arboretum, Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, we had Spring Grove Cemetery, which was a great place to look at woody ornamentals. We had Boone County Arboretum, and then we had, what was that last place? Oh, the Lexington Cemetery. Lexington Cemetery was really great. It was a really cool place as far as flowering shrubs. So for this, we were looking at really two things. We wanted to get what the bee assemblage was. So we wanted to know what species of bees were there, what kind of bees were coming to these plants. So we gathered a 50 bee sample from each of 5 sites per plant species, because we wanted around 250 bees collected from a single plant species to get a good idea of what was coming to this plant species. Additionally, we wanted to measure how attractive a plant species was to bees, so we devised these 30-second snapshot counts. We did 2 for each site, so a minute total of observation, where we would just count the bees that are actively foraging on the flowers of that particular plant. And this gave us a range from some of our plants we were getting 0s and 1s as average snapshot counts. Some of these plants, winged sumac was our highest one, and that one was around 60, 70. In its average snapshot count, which is basically, I found out as fast as I can count bees in a 30-second period. And we did this because we wanted to document some of these. A lot of these we could get 50 bees off of, but we really wanted to put a metric on how much bee activity was there at any given moment. And so we found a lot of interesting things. First of all, we found that different plant species really just attract unique bee assemblages. Whether it's native or non-native, everything, it was a surprise as to what we got. Everything was kind of a mixed bag. Some of the plant species we looked at, like this chase tree, shown here on the right, had a pretty diverse set of bees coming to it. It had things like bumblebees and carpenter bees. It had a couple of honeybees. It had a nice variety of sweat bees coming to it, halictids. It had some megachilids, so a pretty diverse section. Other plants like Philadelphus, the mock orange, shown on the other side, we pretty much had samples dominated by a single species, and this was really cool for us to find because I never would have stumbled across this bee species otherwise. but it was almost completely dominated by this Chelosoma philadelphia, which is a specific leaf-cutting bee that is a specialist on mock orange. So that was a really cool relationship to find. There's not terribly much literature on it, I looked. So that was a really neat thing to find there. Additionally, some of our plants were super, super attractive. I've already mentioned I've already mentioned winged sumac as one of our most attractive ones. I mean, you can barely see the flowers for how many honeybees were on it, at least what we observed in the Arboretum. Seven Suns flower was also a really attractive one, and it's actually in bloom right now in Lexington. There's a couple around the Plant Sciences building. There's one in front of the Law building. Check it out. They smell really nice. They look pretty good. Additionally, BB tree was a pretty attractive one as well. It had a very high snapshot count, especially since most of the ones we were looking at were in highly disturbed areas by big roads. So it was neat to see a high level activity despite all of the disturbance. We also found a lot of plants that weren't very attractive, and these were things that attracted like 1 or 2 bees during our whole observation period. And I will sort of explain a little caveat with this. So azalea, we didn't manage to get a collection of bees off of. We were only able to do a snapshot count because we saw nothing on the pink azaleas that we were looking at. Flowering dogwood, however, we saw a low level of activity. We were getting about average 3 snapshot counts, 3 bees per snapshot count for that one. And we did manage to get a 50 bee sample from them. It just took us a really long time. So on our list, just because we have it as a low snapshot count doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't contribute resources to bees. It's just a low visitation rate. We have also found that flower form plays a huge role in determining whether it's attractive or not. Flowers with open, easily accessible nectar and pollen, and especially if they have copious nectar and pollen, can be very attractive to bees, like this climbing prairie rose you see on the top, and then the PG hydrangea. Both of those were pretty attractive plants when we surveyed them. Whereas flowers with closed, inaccessible, or otherwise sterile morphology didn't really attract much, if anything at all. Even if it has resources, if a bee can't get to it, like this hybrid tea rose, it's going to be really hard for them to struggle down in there, except in the last stages of bloom where it's open. So they can't really get to those, and it's pretty useless for bees. We did see a lot of site-to-site variation, which is very interesting for us. Some plant species were pretty consistent throughout their sites, but other species, like this devil's walking stick, really highly varied from site to site. So you'll see in site 1, we have almost completely honeybees here, and in site 2, we have almost completely sweat bees. So we had 2 plants about the same size, about the same age, kind of similar locations, 2 completely different sets of bees. Why does that happen? Well, we think that there are other landscape level effects that we weren't looking at that might be at play, especially things like availability of other resources, especially water resources nearby, and especially the availability of nesting sites. For example, we might have had a honeybee colony near the site where we found mostly honeybees, whereas the second site might have been more favorable to nesting sites for sweat bees. We don't know, but it's really cool to see. And we, in our preliminary analysis at least, we've gotten a lot of questions about whether natives and non-natives can be equally attractive, whether they're both good for bees. As far as attractiveness goes, we didn't see any significant difference in bee assemblages or bee attractiveness with our snapshot counts between natives and non-native bees, native and non-native plants. And so we're at this point saying that they're both equally good for landscape depending on what you want to get out of that plant. So some of the great trees for bees that we found, some things that are really highly attractive or attract a very diverse set of bees include things like American yellowwood, devil's walking stick, eastern redbud, and I'll read out, I don't know if you guys can actually see this bottom part, so I'll read that out. Things like Ammermachia is the one I have in this far corner, BB tree, Cornelian cherry, and Seven Suns tree as our non-natives that we really liked as far as what we were seeing bee-wise. Additionally, for our shrubs, we found a lot of really cool ones. Bottlebrush buckeye was one that I had never really noticed before, even if it's ridiculously large in most of the settings that we found it. That one had a pretty diverse set of bees, in addition to attracting a lot of really cool butterflies and other pollinators as well. St. John's wort, and this, when we say St. John's wort, I'm talking specifically about Hypericum frondosum is the species that we looked at. Was also a really cool looking one. Summer sweet clethra, Clethra alnifolia, is planted a couple of sites in Lexington and especially in the Arboretum, and comes in a couple of different colors. We like that a lot, and I actually used it for my study plant for a neonic residue study. And buttonbush, which just looks really, really cool. For our non-natives, Glossolabelia, we really liked. It's still in bloom right now in Lexington. It started blooming a while ago, and it's still going, most of the large hedgerows that we have. So that's a pretty amazing long set of resources. Fuzzy Dotsia smells really nice. It's a really nice looking one. Comes in pinks and whites, I believe. And then, of course, PG hydrangea. And some of our underutilized bee attractive plants, these are plants that we had a hard time finding within Lexington and Cincinnati. Some of these might be slightly more common. We just couldn't get in contact with the people or didn't have people that knew where they were, but they were kind of hard for us to spot within the landscape. False indigo is a native. It's kind of a more swampy plant. The UK Arboretum has several plantings of it, and it's really cool. It's got this sort of Cheeto-colored pollen that the bees catch, and it looks like they've been, digging in a Cheeto bag. It's really cool. Climbing Rose was hard. Seven Suns flower, we've only got 2 or 3 in Lexington that we were able to find. Ammermachia, we've just got the one on campus, and then there's one at Gainesway Horse Farm. And so really what we're trying to promote is the use of our database plant recommendations so that we can get really accurate plant recommendations on what's actually good for bees and which bees are coming to these plants. Because a homeowner might be interested in, say, bumblebee-friendly plants, or they might be interested in plants that don't attract carpenter bees when they're planting right next to their new wooden deck. Additionally, we're trying to encourage diverse flowering plants. Don't just keep on planting the same thing over and over again. Like the speaker before me said, diversity is really key as far as insect management, pest management, and disease management. It really goes a long way. In addition, try to think about planting season-long resources, things like BB tree, Seven Suns, Glossolabelia, which are in bloom right now. This is a really scant time for bees and floral resources. Not terribly much is blooming right now. And so having those things that bloom for a long time, that bloom late into the season, can be really, really valuable, especially for things like honeybees and bumblebees, which are still very active this time of year. And altogether, this will promote a more bee-friendly urban landscape, which is really what we're trying to go for here. Additionally, I'd like to plug right quick that I do have preliminary lists out for top trees and shrubs for bumblebees, for honeybees, in addition to information on our ratings for the bee attractiveness. This is available if you email me, and we'll have all of our contact info on our very last slide. If you email me, I can get you a copy of that, in addition to the poster I presented at a pollinator conservation convention conference that has a little bit more hardcore data on what we're looking at and what exactly we found. So acknowledgements, thanks to my lab, thanks to all of our funding sources, and I'm going to turn this over to Adam Baker, our new master's student, who's going to talk about monarchs.